Joshua Rauh.
You get
You did good with time there, Robert. Too.
okay. I follow instructions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I do have some slides that I'd like to show. So let's see if we can figure out how to pull those up here. There we go. Okay, the title of my talk today is Debt in Disguise, the Crisis in Public Employee Pensions. Okay, I want to start out actually just telling you about a recent survey that took place of a well-known forum of economic experts who were asked in a poll. This is a poll run by the University of Chicago, but the poll people were polled were of very diverse universities and political leanings. They were asked if they agreed with the following statement. During the next 2 decades, some U.S. states, unless they substantially increase taxes, cut spending, and or change public sector pensions, will require a combination of severe austerity budgets, a federal bailout, and or default. The responses to this question, 92% of the experts either agreed or strongly agreed. 5% were uncertain, and 3% had no opinion. Okay, so among economic policy experts, it seems widely agreed that there are many states, many local governments that are in trouble. Now, how could we possibly have gotten to this point? Because as I'm sure many of you have heard, 49 of the 50 states have balanced budget laws on their books. So the books say you have to run a balanced budget. How can it be that we've gotten to the point where the experts are talking about U.S. states in language that sounds like the way that they talk about Greece and Spain and Portugal, and yet the states still have these alleged requirements to run balanced budgets? And the answer has got to be in promises for future spending that have not been and still are not being recognized in today's budgetary processes. So let me give you, just to be really clear about what I mean, let me give you, we'll walk through a little example here. Think about this as being a fictitious state, okay? And this is the simplest possible kind of state government I can imagine. So they collect taxes, and those taxes, let's say they're in that bag of money there. The taxes are collected by the government authority. Okay, the government authority then takes the taxes and pays public sector workers. Okay, now, as long as the size of these 2 bags of money here are the same, I think we would say that that appears to be a balanced budget. Now, the problem is that things can get a little more complicated if, in addition to this, we're also promising these hardworking state and local government employees that we're going to give them deferred compensation as well. Okay, this was to illustrate what would happen if there were a imbalanced budget. That would be if they were spending more than they were taking in. But if the 2 bags are the same, you might look at first glance as though there's a balanced budget. But here's the issue. Okay, so these are numbers for California state employees if they work for a 30-year career. Okay, so it's not for everybody, but it's ones who work for a 30-year career, which is a non-trivial share. So, the policeman, the California highway policeman sees that when he retires, he's expecting a pension of $92,272 per year. The fireman is expecting a pension of $106,004 per year when he retires. This is an LA County fireman. The teacher, $79,153. The miscellaneous public employee, $66,864. So the problem is now all of a sudden the budget doesn't necessarily look balanced. The issue is that if we're not setting aside sufficient money today to pay for these pensions, then we're not being fair to future generations, because these future generations, our kids, are going to have to both pay the policemen and firemen and teachers and public sector workers that provide services to them, and they're also going to have to pay the pensions of today's public sector employees. So that may seem like a trivial point, but I just want to illustrate that that's why this problem of deferred comp is a very serious issue. So it becomes very important to figure out, how do we determine whether there is really a balanced budget going on when there are these pension promises in the background. And the way that this is generally determined, well, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, otherwise known as GASB, G-A-S-B, they provide guidelines under which states are asked to assume a return that they're going to earn on the invested assets that get set aside. So essentially, what's going on now is that some of the money from this bag here is getting set aside into a pension fund. And the state government is then assuming that the returns in the pension fund are going to be a certain amount of their budgeting accordingly. So here's the pension fund, and this Gatsby idea is we're going to budget with an assumed return on these assets. What are these assets? Well, they're, historically they've been stocks and bonds in these pension funds. More recently we've had more in the way of alternative assets, private equity, venture capital, hedge funds, real estate, now about 20% of the portfolios. And historically, the portfolio of stocks and bonds, about 60% stocks, 40% bonds that were held, has returned around 8% per year. And as a result, what we still have going on now is that most state and local governments around the country are budgeting, they're considering their budget to be balanced as long as every dollar that they put into the pension systems today earns an 8% compound annualized return, you know, for the entire future forecast horizon. Okay? So now I want to think a little bit about whether this makes sense. Does it make sense to budget with expected or assumed returns on assets? So I'm going to give you an example here. Okay, so think about this as being your personal financial example. Okay, so suppose this is you. Okay, so suppose you have a debt of $100,000 that is due in 15 years. You also have $31,524 in cash. Okay, I'll pick that number very specifically. You'll see how I picked it in a second. And you have no other debts and no other assets. Okay, now suppose that you like a loan to do something else. You go to a bank and you apply for another loan, a new loan. And of course what the bank is going to do is they're going to assess your financial suitability for this loan. Okay, so the bank will assess your financial position. Now, you know, if you have a really good job, a high-paying job, the bank might not be so concerned that you own $100,000, that you owe $100,000 in 15 years. You know, they might look at this and say, well, they've got a good-paying job, so it doesn't matter. If you have no job, they might be more concerned. Okay, in any case, they're going to look, they're going to write this information down, and they're going to make a determination. Okay, now suppose that you had been rejected for this loan, all right? And you were upset, and you went home, and you thought about it. You had an idea. You said, well, suppose I'm going to move the $31,000 that was in cash, $31,524, into stocks and bonds. Will that help? Here's my scheme. Okay, I'm going to go back to the bank, and I'm going to tell them, yesterday I had the money in cash, but today something is different. I have the money in a portfolio of stocks and bonds that historically has earned 8% returns. Okay, because that's what a portfolio of stocks and bonds has done. Will that help? I'm going to go to the bank and I'm going to give them the following. Look, this $31,524 here, in 15 years, that's going to grow to $100,000 because $31,524 times 1.08 to the 15, sorry for the math, is $100,000. So I'm going to tell them, in fact, that while yesterday maybe you thought I had some debt, actually today I am debt-free. Okay, because now this money is in assets that have earned 8% historically. Are you really debt-free? Well, okay, obviously not. Okay, there are many problems with this. But the Gatsby rules would say, for pensions, yes. That as long as this is true, the government would be viewed as running a balanced budget. And there's a lot that's wrong with that. It relates to a number of different things. One of the problems is that many would argue that it may no longer be realistic to assume that this portfolio is going to earn an 8% expected return. We're in an environment today where, on safe assets, you can't really get much, if anything, above inflation. You may even be earning negative yields relative to inflation. There was a time, 10 years ago where you could have a bank account that paid 5% interest and inflation was running at 3%. So I mean, you were making money just leaving your money in safe assets. So it's a lot harder to generate 8%. I think the systems themselves probably would agree that it's a lot harder to earn 8% because you remember they've now got about 20% of the portfolios in these riskier asset classes, which they're doing kind of specifically to maintain the 8% return assumption. The real problem is that these pension promises are guaranteed. They are guarantees, but the investments that we're making, there are no guaranteed returns on those investments. So we've told the public employees we will pay these pensions no matter what the stock market does. That is a guarantee, and the kind of science of finance is pretty clear that you have to then measure that as a guarantee and use discount rates that are more closer to the discount rates on default-free assets. Okay, so the guiding principle from finance would say that the only justification for using a discount rate that is higher than the yield on risk-free assets, which today, I mean, the 30-year government security, 30-year treasury is about 3% yield. The 10-year is about 1.8%. The only justification for using budgeting rates higher than that is if we want to credit state and local governments for their option to potentially default on these assets, and then the pensions aren't actually guaranteed. So we really have an issue here. Either they are guarantees and we have to measure them using guaranteed rates, or they're not guarantees and we can use these high discount rates or higher. It's okay, I'm never going to get up to 8%, but use higher discount rates, but you have to look employees in the eye and say we're going to default on these benefits if the stock market doesn't perform. How does this compare to what other countries do? The Netherlands is probably the country in the world that takes pensions, occupational pensions, the most seriously. They have a very deep occupational pension system, and they measure benefits using risk-free swap curves. So essentially, a one-year promise would be they use a 0% discount rate to measure that. The maximum that they can use for a 30-year promise is 4%. So when I go and I explain that what we're doing here is, in the U.S. here, is that states are budgeting using assumed return on assets, they literally think we are crazy. Okay, now maybe we shouldn't care too much for what the rest of the world thinks, but it's not just the Dutch, it's the UK, it's many other countries. Okay, so they recognize the financial reality here. So what difference does it make? Well, when you take the cash flows that have been promised and you measure them at Gatsby rates, you get about $1.3 trillion in unfunded liabilities. I've also got in this slide, now that I've moved to California, I've gotten kind of obsessed with some California numbers. So I've also got some billions here for CalPERS and CalSTRS, the two big pension funds in California, and for LA. Okay, so this is if you take government accounting as given. This is the unfunded liability. But if you measure it using a default-free rate, then we did a study in 2009 where we found that there were 3.1 trillion of unfunded liabilities. And today, it's even harder to provide a risk-free benefit, even more costly to provide a guaranteed benefit to public sector employees. So we're up to 4.4 trillion, which is over $38,000 per U.S. household. Is that a big or a small problem? Well, compared to federal debt of 16 trillion and much more in Medicare and Social Security, maybe 4.4 trillion is not that much. The problem is that the federal government, they can print money, and state and local governments cannot print money. I also like to compare this to Europe. Greece is 2% of European GDP. They can't print their own money, but somehow they and a few other countries managed to unleash this sovereign debt panic on the continent of Europe. And I pretty much see a number of the U.S. state and local governments as not being very far behind. We're basically 10 years behind where Europe is, and we're pretty much headed in exactly the same direction, where the overextension of some of the state governments is going to lead to the realization that there are a lot of governments out there that have not been properly budgeting, that have been pretending they're running balanced budgets when they're not, that there's a lot of debt in disguise, that we don't know where that is, that we don't know how we're going to work out the contract. How are we going to come up with this money? We don't know. So I think despite the courageous progress that has been made in places like Rhode Island, the measures that have been taken have basically just bought time. I mean, they usually apply to new employees, and they never get to the root of the problem, which is that we are mismeasuring the unfunded liabilities and the costs of these pensions by a pretty dramatic factor. And that, as long as we keep mismeasuring that, as long as we keep doing that mismeasurement, pretending that the benefits are less costly than they are, then any state or local government that runs a defined benefit pension system is going to be running an off-balance sheet deficit, off-balance sheet budget deficit. So we either have to reform the defined benefit accounting, or we have to go to defined contribution plans. One or the other. I don't pretend to say what's better. That would be for something for voters to decide if they were given the right information. That is the sum total of my remarks, and I thank you very much for inviting me in for listening.